losangelesschool.org. So we can start recording now. Just a quick introduction. How are you? My name is Steve Futterman, and I'm the admissions director at the Willows Community School. We're a pre-K through eighth grade program in Culver City. I've been at my school for 23 years now, and I spent 18 of those years teaching seventh grade history and English. I still get to coach the debate team, and then I've been working in the admissions department for 5 years. And I'd like to just move around, introduce you to the other people who are going to be speaking tonight, and we'll start with Alyssa.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Alyssa Dixon. I'm the Assistant Director of Admission at Wildwood School. Wildwood is a K through 12 progressive project-based school in West LA. We have 2 separate campuses, an elementary campus, and then a separate middle and upper school campus. And I'm really glad to be here tonight. Thank you. Kalia.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kalia Dunkelman. I am the Director of Advancement and Admissions at Children's Community School. We are a K through 6 elementary school, progressive school, on the border of Sherman Oaks and Van Nuys. We focus on inquiry-led learning, project-based learning, and all that good stuff. We're happy to be here tonight. Verena?
Hi, my name is Verena Denovi. I am the Associate Head of School and Director of Admissions at the Wesley School. We are a K through 8 school in North Hollywood. And I was one of the founders of the school 25 years ago and have been in admissions that whole time. I love it. Welcome tonight.
We'll go to the next slide if we can, Hadley. Thanks so much. I'm just going to take you through an overview of what we're going to be discussing tonight now that our introductions have been covered. I'll be talking a little bit about what an independent school is, and then move on, talk a little bit about some of the reasons why you might choose an independent school for your children and for your family. And then we'll talk about affordability, recognizing that this is a pretty central question if this is something that you're considering. And we'll do a little roadmap, talk about the process of moving into the independent school world. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A. And just to note, a lot of times these things might happen in a chat, but you'll notice because we're part of a webinar that there's actually a Q&A button down at the bottom. And that's really the place where we're going to house those questions and field those questions. And we'll make sure to get to all of those before we finish for the evening. So we're going to go to the next slide, talk a little bit about what an independent school is. And I'm going to start by talking about these different types of programs and really look at the umbrella of different types of schools, and recognizing that public schools, charter schools, and magnet schools are usually going to be categorized together because they are all under the public school umbrella. And then I'll sort of separate those out, talk a little bit about private schools and independent schools and what the distinctions are. So first of all, when we think about public schools, we're often thinking about your local school system. You register your children and they're welcome to come to those schools. And then when we get to magnets and charters, we're talking about some other distinguishing features. And first of all, they're often smaller schools. They tend to have smaller populations. And both admissions to those schools can be determined by things like lotteries, because there's often high demand for limited numbers of seats. And in some magnet schools, they vet applications through admissions processes that are based on grades or test scores, portfolios, or auditions. Now, charter schools are generally going to be operated by their own leadership teams, so they can have more flexibility. That might mean a longer school day or different types of curriculum. And there's going to be an emphasis on parent involvement. Now, here's an interesting distinction, is that when you talk about charter schools, you're going to have partial government funding and often some private funding as well. And a lot of times the government funding is really going to be determined on the performance of the students in those schools. Magnet schools, on the other hand, are usually centered on a particular theme. So you might have a fine arts magnet, a visual arts magnet, a performance arts magnet, or a science magnet. And those are going to be run entirely on government funding. So next, I want to talk about the idea of private schools versus independent schools. And I think these words are often used interchangeably. And there are overlaps in terms of these types of schools. So might sound a little confusing, but I'll explain, I promise, is that independent schools are actually private schools, but not all private schools are independent schools. So these are the distinctions. Both private and independent schools are not going to be run through government funding, but some private schools are either for-profit schools or going to be run under an umbrella, another kind of umbrella. So sometimes corporations can develop private schools. You can sometimes have religious schools that are going to be putting together private schools, Catholic schools, for example. Now, independent schools are going to be functioning differently because first off, they're always going to be nonprofit institutions, and they're going to be driven by unique missions. And another way that they're independent is the way that they're managed and the way that they're financed. So all independent schools are going to have a board of trustees. Typically, they're going to be made up of either present parents in the schools or parents that were part of the community in the past or other community members. And they're usually going to be supported by tuition payments, charitable contributions, and all of that money that's coming in is going to be brought back into the school systems. And these schools are all going to be accountable to their communities, and typically they're going to be accredited by state-approved accrediting bodies. For it, all the schools that are here tonight are accredited through the California Association of Independent Schools. Now, we talk about this idea of being mission-driven and also of being independent. And the word independence is true when it comes to thinking about these schools. There's a lot of autonomy in independent schools to develop a specific type of curriculum, to develop specific types of extracurricular programs, to have a very central philosophy that we're working from. There's also determining the types of families and students that we think are good matches. So you're going to have a range of values and goals, and by extension, our own culture, our own personality. And if you walk onto a lot of these campuses, you're really going to get a distinct vibe, which would be a word that my 86-year-old father in the Midwest doesn't particularly like. But I think you can feel it when you go to these places, what these schools are often about. And also the application process is going to differ from school to school, but there will be applications, and there's usually going to be interviews for the parents, and even for kindergarten students. Often you're going to be bringing students on campus so that we can get to know them a little bit and make sure we have a fit on our hands. And the last thing I really want to address is this idea of flexibility and freedom. And I want to say that it's a great thing, I think, for independent schools themselves, because we can really think about what is best for children from our perspective, and also a great things for families, because they can really look around and determine what is it that we want for our kids. But we also recognize that that flexibility and that freedom can sometimes be overwhelming, because you've got 59 schools in this consortium and you can't look at them all, which is why events like this are really, really important, because we want to give you some broad strokes tonight that we think can really be helpful in getting you to think about what it is you want for your children and for your families when you consider the school options that are out there. So thanks so much. And I'm going to pass it on to Kalia now, who's going to be talking a little bit about some other elements of the process.
Thank you so much, Steve. So why do you choose an independent school? Through all of everything that Steve just said, I mean, there are myriad reasons, so we'll just go into some of them tonight. What you're dealing with is, as Steve also mentioned, a very diverse selection of schools and communities. There are 59 schools in the consortium, and they all have their own specific missions. They all have their own specific core value sets. So it does behoove you to see as many of them as possible. And when you're looking at them, you are obviously selecting a school for your child, but you're also selecting a community for yourselves, especially when you're talking about kindergarten, elementary school. These are people and families with whom you're going to be sharing a lot of time and a lot of experiences. So you really should look at it. We encourage you to look at it as also choosing a community for your whole family. So look at the options, see what suits you, see what you respond to, and see where your values lie and where you're seeing those values, mirrored back to you and how those are resonating. And those are just some of the ways that you can kind of pare down the very long list of independent schools in Los Angeles. As we were talking about earlier, all of the schools in the LAS consortium have their own missions, which you should seek out when you go on everyone's website. Their mission should be there, and that will tell you a lot about what their school. And all of these schools, of course, are focused on academic growth and educational excellence, but they're also focused on personal growth. And that is something that definitely sets independent schools apart. It's really the reason why you would choose an independent school, among some other things. You get tremendous access. Your children have extraordinary opportunities and are able to delve into so many different subjects and passions that they may have, because the focus is truly on nurturing and sustaining the whole child. As I mentioned, each school does have its own unique value proposition and character traits. Some religious schools will obviously have an instilled religious identity. And then as you research schools, you'll see there are others that will immediately you'll either gravitate to because you recognize something in them, or you feel like that's something that your child will want to aspire to in the coming years. all independent schools really do focus on social emotional learning and well-being. That's definitely a cornerstone to raising children in today's age and always really. So that is definitely something that independent schools offer as a core part of their curriculum. As we've mentioned also on this webinar, independent schools are selective. They're selective because they're building a community of learners, they're building a community of people, and they see, you know, they know what their mission is and they know what their value proposition is. And so within that, you're going to have a very diverse student body, and that diversity comes in many ways: racial diversity, socioeconomic diversity, cultural diversity, myriad opportunities for you and your family to expand your knowledge and just like have a different set of windows and mirrors wherever you go. Independent schools are committed to equal opportunities, and there's a culture of inclusion in independent schools that I know all of the, especially the schools on this webinar tonight, it's a big focus for all of us, and that's something that is definitely sets independent schools apart. What most people, I think, when you think of independent schools, if you're new to the independent school world, is what I originally thought is you have smaller class sizes, right? That's definitely something that is very appealing about independent schools. And we have programs that tailor to individual abilities and strengths. And I think that there was a question actually that was submitted previous to starting this webinar about schools that handle academically gifted children who don't want to skip grades. That's something that's very specific to each school. There are certain schools that are built for gifted children, and there are schools that have more flexible age ranges in their classes. So it's definitely a question that you would want to ask a specific school that you are interested in. With those smaller class sizes, that means more hands-on learning. It means more opportunities for immersive educational experiences, lots of field trips, overnights as they get older. And then, of course, probably the most important thing is a very strong dedication to nurturing a teacher-student relationship as well as a parent-teacher relationship. Teachers at independent schools, because they have small class sizes, because they're mission aligned, they know the students very, very well. And that, especially as your children get older, it is a huge differentiation between independent schools and other schools in the marketplace. Faculty are also usually very supported in their own growth as educators to become masters in their fields. There's often a lot of professional development. So you know that the lessons and the strategies that are being taught, the pedagogy is of the most, modern technologies and philosophies that are in the world. As I mentioned before, certain schools do cater to special interests, special abilities, and populations. So you can really find a school that suits just about anything. It's just a matter of kind of knowing where you want to be and where you think your family will be comfortable and where your family will thrive, and then seeking that school out. So we encourage you to try to find the exact fit for your family, as opposed to seeking out like a one size fits all, or just seeking out the schools that, you've heard of a million times, because there might be another school that resonates a little bit better with you. So it takes a little bit of legwork on your part, but it's definitely worth it. Independent school communities often have shared values and goals and expectations. They set us apart from each other, but they also set us apart as a group from other educational options. And just one last thing, like, we understand as admissions directors, this is can be a very overwhelming process. There are a lot of options, there are a lot of things to consider, and just know that you will find the school that is right for you. And when you tour schools, when you meet current parents at those schools, follow your gut and see, which resonates with you and what you respond to the most, and you will find a successful school for you. So now I will throw it to Verena to talk about financial aid.
Thank you so much, Kalia, and welcome everyone. We're super excited to have you all here and just exploring what is available for a lot of families. Learning about independent schools is new. It's a new landscape to navigate. And I think one of the most overwhelming things is to consider, if you've looked at any of our websites or any independent school websites, the tuition, that when that number first pops up on the screen, it can be very daunting. And we are obviously very aware of that. What you need to remember is that when Steve talked in the very beginning about schools that are funded through the government, I think recently I read something that it's about anywhere from $25,000 to $28,000 is what they are looking at in a public education of what they are spending on a student's education. So that's where you're sort of a minimum starting point, if you will. And so with independent schools, because we are not funded by anything but either direct tuition or through charitable contributions, basically also what Kalia was sharing with you about the number of things that are offered in terms of small class sizes, very specialized programs, extensive field trips and opportunities, specialty types programming, really attending to the whole child and providing a very robust program for it. That's where you get to those numbers that are significant. What every independent school wants to assure families of is that they want a diverse community, as Kalia was talking about, and diversity includes socioeconomic diversity. Nobody wants to have schools that don't have a broad range of students within their school. There are so many studies that are very explicit about the benefit of having people that are different from yourself in your community, and that the breadth of learning that takes place in those environments is far superior than a community that's homogenous. And financial aid is something that every school, it's a part of just independent school charters, is to provide access. And access for many families comes through financial resources. So that should not be something that keeps you from considering an independent school. The resources at each school are there to help you explore how that process works. And most schools will have a separate place on their website where you can walk through their process of how they handle financial aid applications. Most of them happen at the same time that you're applying for the school. You are also simultaneously applying for financial aid, and that application, generally speaking, goes through an independent outside sort of clearinghouse. So there are a number of them that different schools use. You might hear SSS, you might hear FAST, you might hear Clarity, TADS. There's a number of different resources that independent schools use. And part of that is to help create a sense of fairness and non-bias. So that clearinghouse is somewhere where you submit all of your data, your information about income and expenses, and just sort of how your household exists. And from that, the organization or the company that we use will submit information back to the school suggesting a family's ability to make a contribution towards their tuition. From that place, then every school manages it a little bit differently, whether the financial aid decisions live in their business office or they live with the admissions office. But that will become clear as you walk through this and should be explained on the school websites. Financial aid is not a loan. It is not something that you pay back. It is a full grant. So as an example, if a tuition at a school is $35,000 and you receive a $25,000 grant, your commitment to the school is $10,000 in tuition. That's just very rough, but that is not something that you have borrowed from the school or are paying back with interest in any way. That is a gift, if you will, or a grant, and it is not to be repaid. One of the things too that we all know is that even in a public school, in any school, there are additional costs of it. We call that cost of attendance. So most financial aid programs in schools will extend additional offers to support costs outside of the direct tuition cost. So if there are additional fees at a school, the school will typically, on their financial aid area, outline what portion of fees may be covered through financial aid as well. So whether those are if they have additional fees for books or for technology or for field trips or for uniforms or for any of the additional things that are required for the student to attend the school, there is typically, not always, but typically some level of support through financial aid for those additional costs. In the process of applying for financial aid, and the admissions process. So typically you will have an admissions committee that will make a decision on admissions. From there, schools will then also determine whether or not a student that they would like to admit has a financial need. And if they are able to meet the need of that student, there will be an award that comes along with the offer of admission. Exactly how every school, again, because as we were talking about in the beginning, which can make it a little tricky, is we are independent and there is freedom to manage these things a little bit differently at every school. But this is not something that you should avoid talking with the individual at each school. They want to share this information with you. They want to make the school accessible, and they want to make sure that you're very clear on what the process is so that you don't miss any of the steps along the way. Again, it is a very strong commitment. I would say the majority of the schools in the Los Angeles area, their financial aid programs are reach about 20 as an average 25% of the students at their schools. It might be a little bit less or a little bit more, but they are very committed to creating a diverse community within their schools. And then the last thing is that it's just a small aside in the process of financial aid. There's also the need to submit additional documents, most often including tax returns for the previous couple of years, so they can see sort of a pattern of income and expenses for the family. I think that wraps it for me. Steve, you're going to close us out with the roadmap, I think.
I'm
No,
going
I
to take
think
over the
Alyssa's hitting on
roadmap.
that, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I'm so sorry. I'm so
Okay.
sorry.
So what happens now that you have all of this good information? Really, a really great first step is to start doing the research. A starting point can be the LAIS website, which is showing, you're seeing it here in red. You can actually filter by neighborhood, by the grade level that you're looking at. So you can really hone in and look at schools. I think Kalia touched on this too, like explore, don't necessarily go on what you've heard or what you think you knew, 10 years ago. Really, as best you can to visit, whether that's an in-person tour. A lot of schools, I think, have preserved virtual events. I would venture to guess that on most websites you can see some recordings of various events. I also always recommend looking at the social media for a school because you can get a feel for culture, community in that way. And we think about this a lot, this process allows you to reflect on your own education. Sometimes you want something that looked just like what you did, and sometimes you want it to look completely different. So really don't be afraid to research, tour, connect, ask questions. The way that most schools will have you sort of start that process is through an inquiry form. So that might be called something else, request information, inquire, but they're usually pretty easy to find on school websites. And that is a perfect starting point. That gets you usually into the database, and then that will allow you to find out about tours, events, opportunities to visit the campus. And even though we're in the thick of the season right now, I would guess most schools are still hosting tours and events. So it's not too late. Most of us will have application deadlines coming up in December or early January. And so you do still have time to get to know schools, to kind of feel what's right. We always think of admissions at this time of year as you getting to know the schools. Later on, we get to know more about you, but this is the time when you get to really explore. And I think my colleagues on the call tonight have spoken so much about what feels right to your family. What is a place you can call home? Where will your child thrive? And sometimes that's at a few different places. And so getting to, to sort of learn about what those options are is very exciting. So we talked a little bit about this, but once you go through the process, all of us within the consortium, fortunately, we share some of the same forms. So when you are reaching, for example, to your preschool to get a letter of recommendation, or if you're applying for a student in an older grade and might need transcripts, a lot of times you're able to use the form and ask your school once, and then you can send that out to different schools. So that's incredibly helpful. Those forms can be found on the LAIS website, also on the individual school websites. Normally you can find those as well. We talked a little bit about financial aid. I always like to remind families that sometimes schools call it different things. We call it flexible tuition. Some people call it financial aid. Others call it grants. Don't be shy about asking. As Verena said, we want to talk about it and share that information and encourage families to apply. It all comes to a head in March, March 8th. The fun happens at 5 p.m. Pacific time. All of us on this call and all of the schools in our consortium will send out notifications at the same day, same minute. And then you find out. I would say most families probably apply to a couple of different schools. So Oftentimes families will receive an acceptance. They might potentially receive a wait list. And we ask that when you know, tell your schools. It's really helpful in that process. There's lots of things going on during that time. Schools have 1 week. So you find out on March 8th, and then notifications, decisions are due 1 week later. So sometimes you may know immediately and accept that enrollment, and maybe you're sitting with 2 enrollment offers and trying to make some decisions for your family. It's great to reach out to the schools, ask those questions that you still have. It is incredibly helpful on our side to know as soon as you know. That means if you receive a spot on the waiting list, sometimes we might call students from the waiting list 1 day later, 2 days later, but there's a lot of movement that's happening in that time. But as soon as you know, tell us. We humbly request that information sooner than later. What else? And I think the other thing, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit today, that it does vary from school to school. So there will be quite a few things that are similar, and there will be some unique differences. And so just ask your school. It's never a bother. We want to be able to communicate and help families through this process. And we know it can feel like a lot. And so anything that we can do to sort of take the edge off in that way, we would like to do. The other thing, just to backtrack a little bit in terms of kindergarten screenings or assessments, standardized testing, that also will vary from school to school. So the recommendations and the application, the interview Steve mentioned, that will be pretty similar, but check in with your school, just depending on the grade you're applying for. That process may vary a little bit. And I think overall, Kalia said it, trust the process. It works out. It really does have a way of working out. We see that time and time again. And I wish all of you a lot of luck in this. We'd love to take some questions. We have 1 question in the chat, but what you see on the screen, just are some questions to think about as you're exploring schools, to sort of align with the things that are important to your family, things that you're thinking about for your child. I have a few questions here that I'd love to throw out, and maybe Steve, if you don't mind taking the first one. There is someone who is interested in knowing the difference between DK or TK and kindergarten.
Sure. Because our school does have a DK program, I can speak to this directly, and recognizing, of course, that different schools might approach this a little bit differently. But typically, a TK or DK classroom, and these things, the name can vary a little bit, but they're generally the same thing, are for students who are around 4 years old. So for our school specifically, you need to be 4 by September 1st, whereas a kindergarten classroom, while the date can fluctuate a little bit, those are typically for kids who are 5, usually by June 1st or September 1st are usually the 2 main dates that the schools in the Independent School Consortium are using. So a DK program is really going to be about kindergarten prep. Some of the schools are going to be focusing pretty heavily on academic skills to get them ready for kindergarten. Others may have more play-based programs. So in the same way that preschools might be incorporating things that are regio-based or play-based, you'll also see a lot of that in DK programs as well. So it's kindergarten readiness. The advantages for joining a DK program on some of these campuses are, I would say, breaking them down into two different branches. And the first one is that a lot of times it helps students who are a little bit younger to acclimate to these larger campuses before they begin kindergarten programs. I know a lot of these campuses are quite large. Our campus covers 4 acres. We've got sort of 7 plots of land. And so for those kids to come in DK and feel comfortable as they move around to their different specialists during the week, it's nice for them when they're entering kindergarten to have that confidence on campus. And then I think the other piece that's really important about a TK program is just really focusing on a lot of those other skills that younger students are going to need. So helping them with things like collaboration, things like transitions, things like separation. So before you really get into some of those heavier academic skills that are going to begin in most kindergarten programs around literacy and math, it's really focusing on some of those other things that families might be looking for their kids.
Thank you. Just while you're on that topic. I actually got a couple of questions around, is financial assistance applicable for a family in DK or TK? And I said yes.
Sure.
But I just
Yeah,
want
it
to
is. Yeah, it is often applicable. You can apply for financial aid as part of the DK program as well.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in is about twins. I don't know how often this comes up, but we see it at least once a year. Kalia, would you mind speaking to that? How does that look in your experience?
Happy to. Again, excuse me, I think it's something that depends on the school. At CCS, we actually have 3 sets of twins right now, which is interesting because we're a very small school. We had talked to the parents. Sometimes the parents want their children in the same class together. Sometimes the parents want them in different classes. At CCS, we have mixed age classrooms, so that is easy for us to do. But it really just depends on the school and the family, how they want their educational process to go.
I would echo that. I think that's similar at our school also, just depending on life and what's going on for a family. Let's see, please send us more questions.
I
We're
think
happy
there was
to take-
one, Alyssa, that maybe I saw was, did you already respond to that about whether the admissions directors speak to each other about, so I can take that if you
Not
want.
yet. Yeah, I'd love for you to do that. Thank you.
So there's a question that was presented. It says, I'm just going to read it directly. Do the admissions directors speak to each other about overlapping applicants? Do they know all the schools you apply to? And the answer to that is no. We do not share our admission lists with each other. We make those decisions independently. Similarly, tuition decisions are set independently. Our programming is developed independently. So that's really, I mean, that independent school piece really matters. The only thing I will say, and this is to benefit families and schools, is after the admissions process is complete, we do, as a consortium, because we do work collegially, we meet a couple of times a year, and in the spring, we often will fill out a spreadsheet that lets each other know where independent schools might each have openings. So I might look at a spreadsheet and as a K through 8 school say, oh, I have 2 openings in 1st grade, 1 in 4th and 1 in 6th. So another school that receives an inquiry and is full and has no room can provide opportunities for parents by looking at that spreadsheet and saying, here are 3 schools that have openings with 1st grade or whatever in their area. So we do try to help each other and families at the end of the process, if there is still people that are looking for a home and schools that have a home, because that's really at the end of the day, you guys are looking for a school and we're looking for great families. So it is something that, but not during the process itself. So I hope that makes sense.
And Marina, while you're sort of talking about that piece of this process, a question came in just about, so students who have been admitted for TK or DK, they automatically, and maybe Steve, you can speak to this as well, they automatically matriculate to the next grade, which is kindergarten. Is that true?
Can I add something to that really quickly, Alyssa, is that different schools can actually have different philosophies. For us, unless there are reasons to think that we can't meet the needs of a student, the students would. The expectation is that they can matriculate into the kindergarten program. There are some independent schools that have not only have DK and TK programs, but also have preschools that are affixed to their schools. And for some of those schools, there isn't the automatic assumption for families that you can simply move right into the kindergarten program. And so it's something that you want to definitely check into with each one of those schools that you're looking at. If you're looking for a preschool program that has a K through 6, K through 8, or a K through 12 attached.
Okay, thank you. There's 2 more questions here. One question is around first choice. So I know for a lot of families, they'll go through the process and a school will really resonate for them, and that they might call that their first choice school. What do you all recommend? Should we be letting schools know this? How do we do that in a diplomatic way if we want to convey that message to admission directors?
I mean, it's a good question. And I have a unique situation at our school because I also do the admissions, but I also am the counselor for our 8th graders in terms of high school placement. So I'm working both ends of the spectrum. And I've gotten to know the schools that our kids apply to, for whom I am confident that sharing that information will not adversely affect the decision. But I also know that in high schools, in some situations, it's not advised to share that explicitly. So I think that's something that each school, if you're coming from a preschool in an area that may be able to provide some assistance for you, but I will say just for us, we really never, I will say people share information and we always try to say, thank you, we will take that into, make a note of that or whatever. It simply helps us project yield, but it will not affect the admissions decision itself. So for example, 20 spots and we have 40 applications and we're going to offer 25 because not everybody's going to say yes. And I try to predict how many of those 25 are going to say yes and have a sort of a relatively good number. And knowing that information from families about whether or not we're their first choice will help me project that yield. If there's a family we think is a really good fit for the Wesley School, we will admit them, even if they have told us they're really hoping to go to X, Y, or Z, and we're in that mix, but we're not their first choice, because they may not get into X, Y, or Z. And then hopefully if they applied to Wesley, they saw it as a school that was something that they thought was a good fit for their child and their family, and they will end up, and oftentimes, many of you have applied for a job you didn't get and the second job you wanted and you ended up being the best fit, or your college experience or whatever it's been in your life. The school that you didn't think was your first choice and that's where you land ends up being a really good fit. And I think it was Kalia that said, trust the process. And that's what we're talking about, is it all kind of shakes out. So I personally don't think it's wrong to share that, but because we really try to understand that they're going to have different choices, and that's important to understand.
Just to add on to that, though, what I will say is don't tell multiple schools that you're their first choice, because that's something that we end up finding out. And that just makes it very, very difficult for us when we're talking about yield and attrition and all of those things that you don't have to worry about. But out of just the kindness of your hearts, if you choose to share that information, choose just to share it with your first choice.
That is an excellent point. A question came in about if a family is admitted into a school and maybe turns it down for another school and then revisits that school later on, does that adversely affect their admission? And I'm happy to answer this because as a K-12 school, this happens sometimes. And I can speak, very candidly for our school, and then I'd love to hear from you. It does not adversely affect. We really understand. We want a student to thrive wherever they are. And I feel like for us in our office, we'll go, oh my gosh, I remember that student from when they were this age and now they're back. Like, we can't wait to hear what the changes and what the growth has been. And it's exciting for us to revisit with families and students. So, that is sort of our approach, and there's no big mark in the file for our students.
Something that we do at CCS, and I'm not sure if others do this as well, but any accepted family that decides to select another school, we follow up with them. And because we really actually want to know, are you comfortable sharing with us what that decision was about? Because we have, at this point, we've spent, 6 months sometimes with these families, and it's just helpful to know. And so we obviously just go K through 6. So this is a situation that doesn't really ever happen to us. But if a school does reach out to you and you think it's an opportunity that you might be going to middle or high school, you can be honest and say, you know what, it just didn't feel like the right fit because it was too small, or we really wanted some more sports and you didn't have the sports or whatever the reasons were. So that if you do go in middle and high school, it's very easy for that admissions team to go back and say, no, they were forthcoming and they said, these are the reasons and those reasons don't exist anymore. Don't ghost us. Don't just say, we'll figure it out, because we are invested in the process too. And we love getting to know you, and we want you to succeed wherever you go. So please know that as well.
Very much. Can we go back to financial aid for a moment? There's another question I just want to make sure to hit, which is there ever such a thing as full financial aid, where perhaps a family isn't contributing above the cost of tuition, or the entire tuition and the other fees you mentioned are covered? Does that exist at any of your schools?
Yes.
I will say it not as frequently, only because our concern is the challenge that it will present for the child in existing just in the environment of all of the things that come up. And we have done it before. So it's definitely, when we go that route, it's a conversation with the family, just acknowledging the challenge that it might present for the family, and how can we best support them through that so that there aren't any surprises. But typically, we hope that there's room for some contribution, which just creates a stronger sense of investment in the community. And I don't mean financial investment, but it's just being a piece of it. But we have definitely offered full tuition before, but again, it comes with a little bit of a stronger conversation just around what that reality is going to look like, and making sure that everybody understands that up front, because we do want that relationship to last and be successful over the life of the time that the student is there.
Thank you.
That's a good point.
I wanted to go back, I think, because Kalia, you mentioned that it doesn't happen that often when somebody doesn't come, but then comes for middle or high school. And it's maybe not that so much, but a family, we have it right now, a family that we admitted 3 years ago for kindergarten, and they chose to go to another school, totally fine. And they are finding that it's not the best fit for them. And that in hindsight, what they had seen at Wesley was perhaps going to be a better fit for their child. And they are now turning around and reapplying. And it's, again, to Kalia's point, that happens. I mean, everybody, the school and their admission decisions, the family and their choices, make the best decision they can in that moment. But it's never viewed as a wrong decision. It's just, okay, maybe the child has changed over time. The school isn't serving their needs anymore, whatever it happens to be. And they might call you back up, and that's fine.
Lonely in the chat. There's nothing going on in here. We're happy to take some more questions if you have any. I think that's it. Oh, wait, nope, one more. Question is around the interview process for parents and guardians. What does that look like?
It's so specific to every school. I mean, I'm sure we can all answer that, and we'll all have different answers. So maybe we all answer it.
I think one thing that you can expect is that, for the schools, especially if you're applying for kindergarten, that admissions directors or someone in the admissions department, sometimes it might be teachers or other administrators, will be sitting down with the family to just touch base about your kids and what you're looking for and where you're at philosophically in terms of your aims for an education, and also your goals for the type of community that you'd like to be a part of for the next however many years. And so I think really just something to note, because I know that it can be intimidating just to think you're going in for an interview. And I think that sounds like it's like a job application, but our goals as admissions directors are really, truly just to get to know you. That's it. I think all of us work really hard to just try to create a casual, thoughtful conversation where everybody can be very comfortable, and we can all just really be determining, is this going to be a good fit for your family and for our school? And so I think going into those, I say this in sort of on the same note that Verena was bringing up before. I work with my 8th graders. I do mock interviews with them. And oftentimes it's like, just take a deep breath. They just want to get to know you. That's it. So we know how great you are. And, just talk about the things that are important to you. And that's all the schools are looking for you to do. And that's absolutely true for parents as well. I probably wouldn't use that slightly condescending tone I just did with my students, but you get the idea. Yeah.
I actually said that to one of my 8th grade parents this year, not the kids.
Yeah.
I feel like the kids breathe more easily than the parents. No, but I think Steve's right. It's really the process is to, and also to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. We provide a lot of information on our websites. A lot of information is disseminated in an open house. there's just a lot coming at you and you're visiting several schools. So trying to keep it all clear in your head, that interview is one-on-one time where you get to just be exclusive with the admissions director, another administrator or teacher, whomever they're using for their interview process, but to get your questions answered as well. And those are super important. So
can I just say one other thing on the heels of that, that when you're completing your application, it is really a good idea, not that you need to go to town and provide us with book length application responses, but to give us enough information that we just have some things we can use as jumping off points for our conversation in the interview process. That's always really, really helpful in terms of just creating a comfortable environment for everybody.
And then tied to that, we are lucky enough to get to meet kindergarten applicants, most of us. And I think we've talked about this, all schools sort of have a different process for that. And perhaps we can weigh in on what that looks like. What are we looking for when we're meeting 4- and 5-year-olds who might come to visit for a play date?
And Alyssa, it seems there's a number of other questions that have come into the chat at this point as well.
Yep. I'm on it.
I'll say this just right off the bat, just to move things along, right, is that the slide deck, this whole presentation will actually be available on the LAIS website for the next year until it happens again in fall of 2024. So you could certainly have this information available to you there. And then Alyssa, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Does anyone want to touch on the, Verena, will you talk a little bit about that for kindergarten play date or meeting kindergarten applicants?
Sure. I mean, again, I think that's going to be, to Clea's point, different at every school, but similarly, we're not giving an SAT to applicants for kindergarten, promise. The schools today, especially, I think there's been a pretty strong shift to really looking at skill development on the softer skills, more the SEL type skills, and where kids are they in a place that's a readiness to learn, as opposed to how many letters do they know? Can they write their name? I mean, a lot of schools that used to be a model back in the day, and in the best of ways, most schools have shifted away from that. You will still find some for whom that is important, but most schools, because preschools have shifted so heavily to play-based learning, we really are looking for the skill sets of, can a child follow directions? Are they kind to one another? Can they sit and listen to a story for a few minutes? Can they, engage with other students? Are they still in the parallel play place? I mean, we're looking for the, like, where are their skill sets? The more of those skill sets that they have in place, the more successful they will be in a kindergarten learning environment. It doesn't mean that they've got to be in some, it's not like a category or box, but we're really the same way we're interviewing parents and trying to get to know them. We're trying to understand where a child is. And I always talk about building a class. Like, there will be some kids with really high energy and somebody will come up to me and go, my kid hardly talks. And I'm like, that's okay. We need some of those too. So we're really trying to build a class and a small community of learners that will learn from one another, that will support one another. The family piece for most of these schools, as everyone's talked about, is really important. Finding families that are aligned with the school's mission and philosophy will really support that student in their learning. So it really has changed over the years, but happy to have anybody else jump in if their process feels different.
I think the thing I'd add to that too is just, we speak a lot with families about readiness and being ready for kindergarten. And one of the things that we always encourage for families is to connect back to your child's preschool. So if you're not sure if the time is right or when their birthday falls, have those conversations with preschool teachers, preschool directors, and people that spend a lot of time with your child. And really, that's usually our first recommendation. And I'll say also, we're very honest with families too when we meet families in the process. And if we meet a little one and it feels like, gosh, they really need one more year and then they'll be so ready, we let families know that. And so just keeping the conversation open and again, with the child's best interest really at the heart of that. I'm going to put you all on the spot. What is the best question you've received from prospective parents?
Gosh.
That's a tricky one.
My brain's not thinking as well as it should right now.
I mean, I guess I'll just say it's hard
really
for me
good questions.
Sorry, yeah.
No. There's a lot. Like, they ask good questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve, I cut you off. Did you have one?
I was just going to say, it's so hard for me to think in terms of superlatives when it comes to the types of questions that are being asked. But I think things that are really thoughtful in terms of parents asking whether or not a community is really lining up with their individual goals for their children or their family. And so I think through this process every year, there's certainly things that come to the table that are always like, that is a really great question. Sometimes even so much, we'll be honest, if we're like, I'd like to take a minute and think about that. Do you mind if I email you with a quick response? So.
I think maybe I'll jump in. There was a question around finances in terms of understanding a full 12-month cost for a school's program. And then an example of that the financial officer told it was closer to 60 versus 38. I would really struggle to figure out how somebody would have an additional $22,000 in fees. But I mean, for example, our tuition now, I mean, for years now, we have rolled everything into the tuition so that there is no question. There's no field trip fees. There's no book costs. There's no computer costs. There's no PA costs, yearbook. I mean, it used to be there was a litany of fees. I think a lot of schools have moved to really trying to help families understand what the actual cost of attendance is. And we'll even then on their website, for example, I think the only things we have that are additional are if you're buying hot lunch. For us, some schools include lunch in their program, so that's something to pay attention to. Aftercare is available, and there is a fee for that, but for our higher financial aid families, there's no charge for it at all. And then we're a uniform school, but we also provide support for uniforms for families that need it. And we do gently used uniform recycle sales. Every item is $5. So, we really try to minimize the additional costs as much as possible. Attending summer programs, the summer program here, I would say, is pretty commensurate with summer programs at camps and other things. So if you're providing care for your child in the summer months, then that would be whatever you normally would pay would be fairly consistent with the camp programs that we run. So I can't imagine how you would get another $22,000 on top of that tuition. I would say anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 in additional things that might not be as clear, but it really shouldn't be any more than that. It should be pretty laid out on tuition and fees schedule for the school.
I am, oh, sorry, go ahead, Verena.
Go ahead. Well, I didn't know where we were, but there was in your consideration, are kids assessed differently based on potential resources or needs? I'm assuming this is maybe I'm going to read into this because I'm not 100% sure on the question, but if you're asking if a child has known learning differences or known specific needs, the assessment would be similar. And then the determination for admission is whether or not we have the resources to meet that child's needs. For example, coming in at kindergarten, it's not as obvious yet if children have, unless it's something that's been identified early, but oftentimes you won't. But coming into an applicant for third grade, for example, at Wesley, again, this can be different everywhere. But if a child is coming into third grade and the parents share with us that the child is mildly dyslexic or needs additional time for testing, whatever it happens to be, their accommodations, we take a look at the current load of students in our current third grade class that need some accommodations. And we do have learning specialists and we have resources on campus. The question becomes, can we add another student that might need some resources beyond what we would normally expect? And that's, again, a broad stroke, but we want to make sure when we commit to a student and a family that we have the resources to provide support for them.
Leah, would you
I'd like to address this question because I think it's an interesting one up top where someone was asking about student learning outcomes between a school that focuses on academic rigor and play by learning, and how are students learning through play. I first want to say that the idea of learning through play is generally something that you're going to have in those earlier grades, like in a preschool or DK program, which doesn't mean that there aren't play elements that might be incorporated into some of the early elementary grades in all of our schools that might be on here. And I also want to emphasize that you can absolutely have academic rigor in schools that are more progressive. And I think all of us could speak on a in a different format about our brand of progressive education. But when you're talking about learning through play, a lot of times I'll just give like an example in our DK program. Maybe they're going to create a name chart, and that's really playful, where they write all the letters of their name on sticky notes, and then they can put it on some sort of chart, and then they might do some sort of graphing situation to determine who has the most letters in the name or their least letters in their name. There's lots of academics that can be embedded into something that can feel very play-based for children. So it's really about engagement, especially at those younger ages, as opposed to having kids who are maybe 4 years old sitting in rows while teachers are maybe dispensing information that needs to be sort of regurgitated back in a way that can feel maybe a little more old school, which isn't to say there's anything wrong with those systems. And for some families, that is a great fit. But I also think in some of the independent schools, we're really looking at more innovative ways to keep kids engaged with the curriculum and demonstrate their understanding in a way that might be a little more creative or novel.
Yes, I agree with that. And I also think, I mean, there's been so much research, and so many times it's been proven over and over that play-based learning is learning, and you're learning in a lot of different ways, but you're learning communication, you're learning collaboration, you're learning how to advocate for yourself and how to advocate for others. And you're taking what is you may learn in a classroom setting. Like, for instance, we have 6 specialists at CCS, but they work in concert with the classroom teachers. So if they're learning about Japan in the classroom, in art, they're doing Japanese art. They're doing a fan dance in dance. They're doing, they're playing Japanese instruments, music. A lot of people might think that that's playing, but that's just offering our students a lot of different avenues in order to access the subject, because we don't really know, especially in the early elementary years, what's going to light that fire in them and what's going to light the recognition in them, especially when you're talking about K1, 2. As Steve was just saying, not a lot of children, it's difficult to sit in a chair for a long time. And when you actually get in and you're doing something, that learning finds roots in your brain in a different way. Like, we do a lot of block building at CCS in the early years. They're block building things that they've learned. Like, if they walk to the library, they're going to block build the library. And then it's all about recall memory and what they think of architecture and all the math skills that go into building that. So it is learning, absolutely. And it is rigorous. It's just a very different way of doing it than the traditional pedagogy of education.
It does not look like what most of us did.
No.
Sort of combining 2 questions in terms of that TK readiness, like if there's an option to sort of stay at the preschool or stay in the childcare for TK versus moving on to an independent school. Steve, would you speak to that? And then sort of through the admission process, how you're assessing the TK kids versus kindergarten?
Sure. We're not looking for the same type of readiness when it comes to DK or TK students that we would be for kindergarten. They're generally a year younger. So we're going to have sort of different thoughts on that process. But again, we were speaking a little earlier about, does this feel like a child who seems like they've got budding skills that are going to help them with things like collaboration and engagement and the kinds of things that are often going to be necessary in independent schools, because they are smaller communities. And we want to make sure that either kids have burgeoning skills in those areas, or feel like the families are really aiming to make sure that those kids are sort of functioning that way within a community. And I think, as Verena said, some schools are looking for a lot of academic markers when kids are coming in at 5 years old, and then other schools are really looking for some other things. That's why it's good to get to know the individual schools, and they'll tell you pretty openly what it is they're looking for in these processes. So I think some of the questions that have come in the chat, we really want to be mindful of your time, have been asking for some specific things that are sort of tough for us to address, only because different schools have very different philosophies in terms of what they're looking for to build their communities and the type of student that might be right for them. Sort of seems odd to call 5-year-old students, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
And then just our last question, agree, we want to let everyone on with their evening. Maybe we could all answer this just in terms of advice for the parent interview. Most of us will be interviewing parents and guardians. Any words of wisdom before people embark on those adult interviews?
Be yourselves. Ask questions about the school specifically that you actually have. Don't just like make up the questions, and be authentic. And, even if there are things that are concerns for you, share those. We really, as Verena was saying, like, we really do just want to get to know you. And it's, you know, kindergarten, I don't think anyone actually interviews kindergartners, but it's the same kind of the thing for children too. Like, we just want to get to know them, you know, and that's just the best way to do that. Just have a conversation with us.
I agree with that. I think sharing strengths and stretches, really laying it out there. We'd much prefer to have those conversations in the process and upfront about areas of growth, and a little bragging as well is always enjoyable. And then I fully agree also, Kalia, just be authentic, be who you are. Verena?
Well, I think the one thing I would say is it's good to hear from a family what it is about, why do they see their child and their family as a good fit for your school? Because it helps me understand whether they saw what it is that we're about. Did we communicate well enough to them that what they're looking for is something we can deliver over time? And so if I hear from a family that they think XYZ are the reasons that they're a good fit for Wesley, and those are things that we definitely is part of who we are and part of our mission, then it feels like it's going to be a good fit, you know, from their perspective, which is important to know. If the conversation is, it's like, wow, those are really not things that are a strength for us necessarily. And I'm surprised that they would have thought that was, you know, whatever it happens to be. So I think it's really just a great time to share about what you're looking for, what you're hoping for your child, and then to hear from the school whether or not they think they can deliver that for you.
And I guess the last thing I'll say very briefly is just to say we're looking for a match. I think that's that everybody involved in this process is looking for.
Yeah.
That's a wrap. So thank you all so much for joining us and sharing your evening with us. And as Steve mentioned, this will be recorded and available on our website soon, I would imagine.